and spending left me cold. For comic relief, I took up smoking again and whiled away the afternoons in air-conditioned coffee shops, ordering lemonades and grilled cheese sandwiches as I listened in on conversations and worked my way through every article in 3 different newspapers. Time passed. On the morning in question, September 18th, 1982, I left the apartment somewhere between 9:30 and 10 o'clock. My wife and I lived in the Cobble Hill section of Brooklyn, midway between Brooklyn Heights and Carroll Gardens. I usually went north on my walks, but that morning I headed south, turning right when I came to Court Street and continuing on for 6 or 7 blocks. The sky was the color of cement, gray clouds, gray air, gray drizzle borne along by gray gusts of wind. I have always had a weakness for that kind of weather, and I felt content in the gloom, not the least bit sorry that the dog days were behind us. About 10 minutes after starting out, in the middle of the block between Carroll and President, I spotted a stationery store on the other side of the street. It was wedged in between a shoe repair shop and a 24-hour bodega, the only bright facade in a row of shabby, undistinguished buildings. I gathered that it hadn't been there long, but in spite of its newness and in spite of the clever display in the window, towers of ballpoints, pencils, and rulers arranged to suggest the New York skyline, the paper palace looked too small to contain much of interest. If I decided to cross the street and go in, it must have been because I secretly wanted to start working again, without knowing it, without being aware of the urge that had been gathering inside me. I hadn't written anything since coming home from the hospital in May, not a sentence, not a word, and hadn't felt the slightest inclination to do so. Now, after 4 months of apathy and silence, I suddenly got it into my head to stock up on a fresh set of supplies. New pens and pencils, new notebook, new ink cartridges and erasers, new pads and folders, new everything. A Chinese man was sitting behind the cash register in front. He appeared to be a bit younger than I was, and when I glanced through the window as I entered the store, I saw that he was hunched over a pad of paper, writing down columns of figures with a black mechanical pencil. In spite of the chill in the air that day, he was dressed in a short-sleeved shirt, one of those flimsy, loose-fitting summer things with an open collar, which accentuated the thinness of his coppery arms. The door made a tinkling sound when I pulled it open, and the man lifted his head for a moment to give me a polite nod of greeting. I nodded back, but before I could say anything to him, he lowered his head again and returned to his calculations. The traffic out on Court Street must have hit a lull just then, or else the plate glass window was exceedingly thick. But as I started down the first aisle to investigate the store, I suddenly realized how quiet it was in there. I was the first customer of the day, and the stillness was so pronounced that I could hear the scratching of the man's pencil behind me. Whenever I think about that morning now, the sound of that pencil is always the first thing that comes back to me. To the degree that the story I am about to tell makes any sense, I believe this was where it began, in the space of those few seconds, when the sound of that pencil was the only sound left in the world. I made my way down the aisle, pausing after every second or third step to examine the material on the shelves. Most of it turned out to be standard office and school supply stuff, but the selection was remarkably thorough for such a cramped place, and I was impressed by the care that had gone into stocking and arranging such a plethora of goods, which seemed to include everything from 6 different lengths of brass fasteners to 12 different models of paperclip. As I rounded the corner and began moving down the other aisle toward the front, I noticed that one shelf had been given over to a number of high-quality imported items. Leather-bound pads from Italy, address books from France, delicate rice paper folders from Japan. There was also a stack of notebooks from Germany and another one from Portugal. The Portuguese notebooks were especially attractive to me, and with their hard covers, quadrille lines, and stitched-in signatures of sturdy, unblottable paper, I knew I was going to buy one the moment I picked it up and held it in my hands. There was nothing fancy or ostentatious about it. It was a practical piece of equipment, stolid, homely, serviceable, not at all the kind of blank book you'd think of offering someone as a gift. But I liked the fact that it was cloth-bound, and I also liked the shape, 9 1/4 by 7 1/4 inches, which made it slightly shorter and wider than most notebooks. I can't explain why it should have been so, but I found those dimensions deeply satisfying. And when I held the notebook in my hands for the first time, I felt something akin to physical pleasure, a rush of sudden, incomprehensible well-being. There were just 4 notebooks left on the pile, and each one came in a different color: black, red, brown, and blue. I chose the blue, which happened to be the one lying on top. It took about 5 more minutes to track down the rest of the things I'd come for. Then I carried them to the front of the shop and placed them on the counter. The man gave me another one of his polite nods and started punching the keys on his cash register, ringing up the amounts of the various items. When he came to the blue notebook, however, he paused for a moment, held it up in the air, and ran his fingertips lightly over the cover. It was a gesture of appreciation, almost a caress. "Lovely book," he said, in heavily accented English. "But no more Portugal. Very sad story." I couldn't follow what he was saying, but rather than put him on the spot and ask him to repeat it, I mumbled something about the charm and simplicity of the notebook and then changed the subject. "Have you been in business long?" I asked. "It looks so new and clean in here." "1 month," he said. "Grand opening on August 10. As he announced this fact, he seemed to stand up a little straighter, throwing out his chest with boyish military pride. But when I asked him how business was going, he gently placed the blue notebook on the counter and shook his head. Very slow, many disappointments. As I looked into his eyes, I understood that he was several years older than I'd thought at first, at least 35, perhaps even 40. I made some lame remark about hanging in there and giving things a chance to develop, but he merely shook his head again and smiled. "Always my dream to own store," he said. "Store like this with pens and paper, my big American dream. Business for all people, right?" "Right," I said, still not exactly sure what he was talking about. "Everybody make words," he continued. "Everybody write things down. Children in school do lessons in my books. Teachers put grades in my books. Love letters sent in envelopes I sell. Ledgers for accountants, pads for shopping lists, agendas for planning week. Everything in here important to life, and that make me happy, give honor to my life." The man delivered his little speech with such solemnity, such a grave sense of purpose and commitment. I confess that I felt moved. What kind of stationery store owner was this, I wondered, who expounded to his customers on the metaphysics of paper, who saw himself as serving an essential role in the myriad affairs of humanity? There was something comical about it, I suppose, but as I listened to him talk, it didn't once occur to me to laugh. "Well put," I said. "I couldn't agree with you more." The compliment seemed to lift his spirits somewhat. With a small smile and a nod of the head, the man resumed punching the keys of the cash register. "Many writers here in Brooklyn," he said. "Whole neighborhood full of them. Good for business, maybe." "Maybe," I said. "The problem with writers is that most of them don't have much money to spend." "Ah," he said, looking up from the cash register and breaking into a big smile that exposed a mouthful of crooked teeth. "You must be writer yourself." "Don't tell anyone," I answered, trying to keep the tone playful. "It's supposed to be a secret." It wasn't a very funny remark, but the man seemed to think it was hilarious, and for the next little while it was all he could do not to collapse in a fit of laughter. There was a strange staccato rhythm to his laugh, which seemed to fall somewhere between talking and singing, and it rushed out of his throat in a series of short, mechanical trills. "Ha ha ha, ha ha ha, ha ha ha. No tell nobody," he said, once the outburst had subsided. "Top secret, just between you and me. Sew up my lips. Ha ha ha." He went back to his work at the cash register, and by the time he'd finished packing my things into a large